So Dan and Jeremy were talking about increase in access to information. I'm going to talk about increased access in terms of access to politicians. So I'm going to, in the next few minutes, discuss some finding from a recent experiment that recent experiment that I conducted in Uganda with McCartan Humphreys and with Gabby, and let's motivate the study. So a starting point is the idea that to extend that politicians' behavior is a function of what they think are the priorities of their constituents, then the quality of democratic institutions as a tool of political representation really depends on the ability of citizens to articulate their interest. And we know that in many developing countries we've got problems of interest articulation. So some of them, for example, will be weak communication channels between citizens and members of parliament. But others are just like the idea that political access is just distributed unevenly. So men have more access than women. Rich people have usually more access to politicians than poor people. Now, this would not be a problem if all people had the same interest. But we have good reasons to believe that this is not the case. So the goal for many people that work on politics in developing countries is to think, how can we design institutions and system of communication that are more inclusive and increase political representation? Okay? So this brings us into the world of ICT. So in the last few days, we've been talking about the fact that there's an IT revolution in many parts of the world, Africa included, especially in mobile technology. So probably many people in the room know this statistic that less than 20% of Africans report ever using a computer, but almost everyone has access to a mobile technology, okay, a mobile phone, okay? And we know that there's like really exciting innovations with mobile technology now in the realm of health and agriculture and financial service, but less so in the world of kind of governance, okay? So what we believe is really the next frontier, and I think a lot of the people here in the room share this idea, is that finding ways to use ICT innovation, especially mobile technology, into strengthening political representation and political accountability should be the next frontier, okay? And this is the world in which we need to situate this study. Basically, what we're trying to do is to look at what happens when you increase the availability of communication platforms. So we're going to be looking at the study of how is the availability and the cost of communicating with one MP using an SMS technology will affect both who gets to be heard and what gets to be communicated, okay? And what we did before we conducted this study, we listed 6 questions that we find very interesting and still lacking in the that we know relatively little about, and we designed our study specifically to be able to address some of these questions. So I'm going to run quickly on the questions that we try to address. So the first one is just very basic. When we introduce a new ICT platform to connect between citizens and the representatives in parliament, will that flatten access, or will that just exacerbate inequalities in political engagement? And there's 2 different schools of thought. Some will say, no, don't introduce an ICT platform at this stage because all the poor people, they don't have mobile phones and you're only marginalizing them further. But there's also really good reasons which we lay down in our paper to why marginalized populations like the poor and women might have an interest in adopting ICT innovations in a higher rate, you know, because of the cost, because they're impersonal. We go into that in our paper. So this is the first question that we want to address. The second question that we want to address is when we look at the priorities of people that are now politically engaged, okay? We think that there's a distance between their priorities and those of the general population. So can we shrink this distance by introducing an ICT platform? Okay, so the users of ICT communication, do they have priorities that are closer to those of the general population? That's the second question we address in this paper. The third question we're going to be addressing in the paper is the following. So when we design a platform of communication, there's many aspects of the system that can affect the usage and how people use it. Okay, so in this study, we're going to focus on one design element of the system, which we think is fundamental, which is just basically the cost. Okay, so the idea would be how the cost of communicating with one's MP will affect the uptake. Okay, and we will be making some assumptions that the higher the cost, the less will be the uptake. Okay, so we assume that the higher the cost, the less will be the uptake, but there's reasons to believe that different citizens might have different price sensitivities. So we might think that poor people, for example, might be more sensitive to the cost. So one of the things we try to do in this paper or in this project is to see what are the characteristics of citizens that will make them more price sensitive. For them, the subsidy that we might want to provide will be more effective. Now, it might be that this is not just about the characteristics of the citizens that are important. It might be the characteristics of the MP, okay? So, and the constituency. So to the extent that voters are strategic and they condition their behavior on whether they think the MP will respond to them, they might be more price sensitive if they think that the MP is not really likely to respond, okay? So that's another thing we'll be testing. So for example, it might be that the price effect will be much stronger when there's an opposition MP that doesn't have much power, so you're going to be more price sensitive. And the last question we ask ourselves is, does the cost of communication will affect not only who sends the message, but what are the type of messages sent? And here we're going to make we're making some assumptions about, or we hypothesize about the idea that it might be that when you have more expensive communication, you see people shifting to more private requests than public requests. So we're going to be looking also at the effect of cost on whether people are sending private requests or public requests. Okay, so to answer all these questions, we conducted a field experiment in Uganda in the summer of 2011. We set up an ICT platform. We programmed it to store messages and to reimburse users. And then the experiment took place using about almost 4,000 respondents, survey respondent in Uganda's, in all of Uganda's 238 constituencies, and the service was introduced to these survey respondents at the end of the survey after we elicited a lot of information about the demographic and political level of political participation. And we introduced it using a standardized script. These almost 4,000 people were then randomized into 3 treatment groups blocked by constituency, which each treatment group is a different price level. A third of them got a script and a voucher that said, well, here's how you can send a message to your MP, and the price was full price. Then there was a partial subsidy, which was a half price, and then third got a full subsidy, which is a free price. Okay? So let's look at some descriptive statistic. We got, out of the 3,790 people that we approached, we got 248 messages. So the uptake was about 5–6%. We can discuss in a Q&A, is that high or low? Think of Iceland with its 1% that we discussed yesterday. Some messages we had to discard because people didn't put the survey ID. Then we were left with 173 valid messages. We coded 98 of them as private requests, and 71 of them were public requests. So the first question is, so let's start looking at answering some of the questions we posed before. The first question is, does the introduction of an ICT platform flatten access to politics? And the answer is yes. And the way we look at it is the following. So we coded all our 3,790 respondents as people that are highly engaged in politics and low engagement in politics. And we've also coded them as whether they're marginalized or not. Okay? And we can talk about the measurements in the Q&A if you're interested. And then we do the following. we look at the share of marginalized respondents among the SMS users, and we looked at the share of the marginalized respondents using that were coded as engaged using existing channel of access. And for us, the platform can flatten access if we see that the share at the bottom will be larger. So we see a 7% increase. Okay? And when we break it down to different types of group, we see that the big effect is coming not so much from the poor people, but if you see in the second one, from women and from people that live in distant areas that value a mobile communication, they value it highly. So that would be our first finding. The second question that we posed was whether the priorities of ICT users will be closer to those of the general population than the ones that are raised through traditional means of high engaged group, and the answer was no. And I'll skip that. The third question that we posed was, does less expensive communication result in greater levels of communication? So basically, are people responding to the price up to the subsidy in an expected way? And the answer is yes. People like a service in which you connect to your MP is a well-behaved product. If we look at the free treatment group, we have an uptake of about 6%. These are uptake rates, and it drops down to about 4% when people need to pay the full price. Okay? But we have also some additional non-findings that are interesting that I wanted to kind of present. So the first thing, we don't find any heterogeneous effect. So we don't find that any of the citizens' characteristics mediated the price effect. So price sensitivity was unrelated to people's characteristics, whether it's their gender, whether it's their poverty, which is interesting. It's interesting, especially because we had a very strong prior that poor people would be more price sensitive, and we're not finding that. We don't find that any of the MP characteristics mediated price effect. And in terms of type of messages, we did not find that price subsidy resulted in switching to more public messages, unlike our original expectation. So let's kind of put together the findings. So the first finding, which is important, it's important take-home, suggests that at least in the conditions of this experiment, opening a new IT platform through SMS that connects between citizens in a country like Uganda and the representative in parliament has a potential of flattening political access. Okay, so marginalized population engaged in a higher rate than people that have existing channels of communication. And an important finding is that people that are more marginalized were not more price sensitive. So these are two important findings. Importantly, though the price of contacting one MP had a strong effect of level of political participation, it had no effect on the type of political communication. So the share of public request was very similar at all price levels. Okay? And another thing, we found very little evidence of strategic behavior by citizens. So, for example, MP characteristics and the expectation of MP responsiveness did not factor in our citizens into citizens' behavior. But I want to end with the idea that this study also raises some very interesting and important questions about external validity, because there's some stylized conditions in this experiment that may not apply when we decide to scale up the program. So I'm involved also in an evaluation of a platform that NDI guys were talking about before. It's called YouSpeak in Uganda, in which we took this small experiment and we tried to scale it up to the entire country. Okay, and we made this available to half members of parliament, and we introduced the system using radio ads. So people, every person in the, potentially in half of the constituencies of Uganda was able to send text messages. And what we found, for example, in the last few months, we got 1,700 messages, and we called back all the people that send us messages, okay? And one of the questions we asked them was, what's the agenda, okay? And we found, for example, that 90% of the people that called into the system or text into the system when we scaled it up are men, and only 10% are women. Whereas what I presented here was that 55% were women, only 45% men. That's kind of interesting, okay? And just throwing some ideas of why this could be. This is still in a stage in which we are like, this is still an ongoing project. One could be that women just don't have access to radio. Second, in this study, we gave them a voucher and said, if you want, you can contact your MP. So that might have empowered them. But when they hear it on the radio, they're like, well, I don't know. I hear that you can contact your MP, but that's not about me. This is for someone else, okay? So this suggests that this is not just about putting in place a system. The way we approach the citizens, the way we describe the system, the way we market the system can have very strong effects on not only on what people send, but who sends messages. And I want to end here.